Prosperity in Black America. What will this require? Is Black business prospering? Are we reaching women and minority-owned businesses? How do we achieve earning parity for wealth for our families? Do our children really have access to education? Will our families have choices for our children? Prison pipelines, mass incarceration, tearing our families apart. A healthcare system not accessible to the masses. The disproportionate termination of Black women from corporate America. When will we actually begin to address what's really at play? How do Black people gain more power to help make these changes? This requires a lot of political will and courage. I'm that provocateur of change. I am Cindi Bright. Welcome to HeartBeat. Good evening, everyone. Welcome to HeartBeat. I'm your host, Cindi Bright. Thank you for joining us again this evening. We're excited to have maybe somewhat of an unusual conversation tonight on HeartBeat, as I decided that I wanted to have a conversation about faith. And I intentionally did not choose the term religion. I chose it to be faith. I wanted to talk about prosperity in Black America and what is, for most of us, our underlying foundation, which is faith. And it's kind of not the way you hear it in the news every day. We're going to talk a lot about this evening about how faith and religion is being used as a weapon and turning people away from something good. So we want to have that conversation tonight. I was thinking today about my childhood. I was thinking about in the 5th grade, there was a kid. I'll never forget him. His name is John. And I was trying to remember his last name because I remembered him so well. He was this big, kind of doofus looking kid. And he had a lot of really bad acne, and he always carried a Bible around with him everywhere he went. And I remember watching the kids pick on him all the time. I remember that. I'm, older now, but so in 5th grade, I don't know, how old is that, 12 or something years old. I remember how upset I used to get watching the kids pick on him. I'm raised in the church. I'm not one of the people that walks around carrying a Bible, but I carry God in my heart and do the work. I am hands and feet. I'll just put it that way, of making sure that people are provided for and taken care of. And I fight for folks and try to help do right in the world. We all have our own way of displaying faith in our lives. But I've watched it get used, particularly against Black women. We're on air every week talking about impact of Black women. I've watched it happen in the workplace. So much to talk about this evening on this topic. So let me welcome in our co-host with me this evening, Dr. Karen Johnson, known as Dr. J, Erin Jones, and Stefani Coverson on with me this evening to talk about. Good evening, ladies. How are you all this evening? I appreciate that you will have this, that we are going to have this conversation, because this is not something you ordinarily hear or talk about. And I don't think we can go on, Channel 4 and talk about faith and what this all means in our lives. But I just kind of wanted to, Erin, I know you were yesterday, was it today? Today down at the legislature saying prayers for the end of session and civility amongst our politicians. And, where do we begin with this conversation about what faith means to all of us and kind of who we are, what we're rooted in?
It's interesting thinking about saying a prayer in our state house. There were some pretty explicit rules about it can't be a particular faith prayer. It has to be a prayer that is welcoming of people of all faiths, so Baha'i and Hindu and Muslim and Buddhist. And I walk through the world thinking that way anyway. What are the common elements to faith practices? It's kindness and it's compassion and it's justice and mercy and grace. And so I thought about that today as I was walking into the gallery. And I think so often, especially for white American evangelical Christians, there's this pressure to talk about Jesus all the time, but not to be Jesus.
Mhm.
So there's this pressure to invite everybody to be Christian, but not to exhibit the fruit of the Spirit and grace and love and mercy. But for me, as I think about my faith, I don't need to say Jesus because I believe in being Jesus wherever I am. And so I get to be in the public square, a lot of places where in Washington state, we can't say Jesus for sure. If you go down to Texas or, the Bible Belt, there's lots of people talking about Jesus, but I don't see a whole lot of love of Jesus in a lot of spaces that I'm in. And so I feel really compelled right now to try to live out, how did Jesus model love every day? And how can I show up in that way? And so it was such a gift to be able to give the prayer today, knowing that they're at the end of a really long session, or a short session, but they'd had a long night. They were up till 2 a.m. So nobody had slept, and you could tell people were exhausted, and it had been a really tough night. So people were kind of us against them, the Republican versus Democrat. And I'd felt the night before, like, I just pray for peace, and I pray for civility, and pray that God would show a way for them to find harmony even in these troubled times. And it was just amazing to see on both sides of the aisle the numbers of people that were really grateful. So I think people want those faith practices. I think everybody wants those kinds of things. They want mercy and they want kindness, and I think we're all seeking that out.
Mhm. Dr. J, did you have something to add to that?
I do. I was thinking, as Erin was talking, I was thinking about, my last interview with the state, and was asked by the governor and his chief of staff. Both of them brought up my faith because I don't know if it's the good news or the bad news. I believe in living the red. And for those who don't know, the words in the Bible that are red are attributed to Christ. And I was asked about, or the conversation went like this: "Oh, I've watched you from afar and have admired how you wear your faith publicly on your sleeve. I too am a person of faith, and just wondering how that has impacted other people." So clearly, my response was, "Well, you'll probably have to ask them." However, there are some who receive it, some who don't. But what everyone will tell you, if they're honest, is Dr. J is firm and fair. When the governor asked me, "So, Dr. J, you're a missionary. Is that literally or figuratively?" I said, "Yes, both." Literally, I am an ordained minister. Figuratively, I am a missionary. And the definition of missionary is those who help people, not to be confused with proselytizing, because quite frankly, where one spends eternity, even if they believe it, is really not my concern. That's between them and their creator. I'm concerned about what is it that we're going to do to make this society the best place that we can for everyone. Now, I just happen to be using what I learned as an acronym back in the day: basic instructions before leaving Earth. So therefore, my code or standard for which I'll be held accountable for might or might not be the same as others. But it is, I think I'm just amazed that now in 2024, we even have to have this conversation about faith. Many talk about separation of church and state. Well, Thomas Jefferson, back in the day when he was writing that for historical context, if that wasn't to make sure that people didn't say Christ or whomever they serve in state, it was to make sure that state could not dictate who people worshiped. It wasn't to take God out of state, it was to take state out of determining which religion you had to follow as they experienced in England. And so I'm delighted that we're going to have this conversation about of women of color in general, but Black women in particular,
Mhm.
because many, especially in my generation, were taught to love everyone. And I have to admit, that was hard for me, being sexually abused for a significant period of my time, and had to figure out, how do you love someone who's hurting you,
Mhm.
right? And how do you separate loving a person from what they do?
I'm curious, Dr. J, why was the governor asking you or commenting about um, if you are a missionary figuratively or literally? What was the context of why that question was asked?
I saw it as honoring who I am. You talked about in your opening who we are. There's no hiding who I am. And in
Mhm.
interactions with the legislators and that particular governor earlier in my career on another matter, I was part of the faith community.
Mhm.
I showed up in hearings with a Bible and the Constitution, just so no one was confused.
Mhm.
So for him to ask me that question when in running for a major cabinet position on his team, I thought it was quite fair to honor and acknowledge who I was, and to hear from me who I am, so I could message at my own narrative, message myself, as opposed to him listening to the advice or input from others who may have had a different narrative about who I
Mhm.
am. Mhm.
Mhm. Stephanie, did you have some thoughts that you want to ask? Welcome in. I haven't talked to you in a couple days. How are you this evening?
I'm good. I'm always excited to be in community with y'all. So I'm glad to be here. And I think this is an important conversation. And for me, was raised in the church, Catholic, and which is in and of itself, I always get kind of the raised eyebrow, like, a Black Catholic, really? Those people exist?
Right.
Um,
None of us
but
just thought that.
but I think for me, I think it has been the weaponization of Christianity against people of racialized and minoritized communities. Um, uh, the I'm going to call it the abuse, like supporting policies that abuse the poor, that abuse women, that abuse the unhoused. Um, it makes it very difficult to continue to participate in organized religion. And so I would say, I think at this juncture in my life, I would describe myself as a spiritual person, a woman of faith, and I do not need a translator to talk to God. Like, I feel comfortable and confident to have those conversations without, a clergy person um, sending up the telegram or whatever up yonder. Um, and I
Timber.
think, and I think the other thing about all of this is this idea uh, of people talking about, I'm a Christian, I'm this, I'm that. And it reminds me of people who say, I'm a grown ass woman or
Mhm.
I'm a grown ass man. And it's typically the people, like, if you're a grown ass person, you don't need to say you're a grown ass person, because the way that you carry yourself, the decisions you make, the way that you choose to show up communicates that.
Mhm.
And so for me, being of faith is operating in such a way that people are drawn to you to ask you about, uh, your religion, or how you came to move the way that you moved. And this idea of beating people over the head with religion and you're going to hell, and because I don't approve of you, that means that I get to have a say because I'm religious, and Jesus said, and I get to tell you what Jesus said, when really I'm over here doing all these other things that Jesus doesn't like either. And so
Mm.
I think if more people would focus on, uh, you know, acting, behaving, navigating in a way that they believe Jesus would like, um, everybody I think would be in a better place, right? And again, I'm talking about the dominant religious group here in the United States. So just
Yeah.
recognizing, of course, that everybody does not believe in Jesus. So totally recognizing that. Um, these comments, I think, are more of, uh, I guess, Christian supremacy, right? These behaviors around Christian supremacy in a way to demean and control others. So that's what I'm thinking about for today. That was a whole bunch, but those are my starting comments and I stand by them.
You know, one of the things I wanted to, mention is that not all um, the expectation that people have, I guess, if they believe that you are a Christian or a spiritual person, then in their minds, they believe you should be A, B, and C. And many of us don't show up as A, B, and C the way that they translate what that's supposed to look like. And so there is a backlash, if you will, for folks who um, may just have different styles or characteristics about themselves that people can't see past because they want to judge you and put you in this box, and or they want to use the fact that they know that about you as a way to destroy you and use it against you. And so I guess I'm asking the question, have you experienced that sort of reaction from folks? I know I do. I get it. I get that backlash because of my fiery personality. What are your thoughts about that, Erin? You were
Oh
nodding
yeah,
yes. But
I
yes,
got lots of thoughts about that. I
yeah.
mean,
Go ahead.
of course, you and I having run for office, I didn't realize till I ran for office that being in my church, people assumed that as a good Christian, you should run as a Republican.
Mhm,
And I didn't
mhm,
know that because I was not raised in an evangelical church. I was raised in the American Protestant Church of The Hague in the Netherlands, which was more like Presbyterian, Lutheran, Methodist style. And so that's my roots are there in more traditional. My parents are from northern Minnesota, so Lutheran country. And when I came to the US, I gave my life to Jesus in a Black Baptist church, literally on the backside of the playground of the Fresh Prince of Bel-Air. That
mhm,
playground literally sits on the backside of the church that I went to in college, which is kind of crazy. But I went there for a while. Then my husband was a pastor in a Black Baptist church. He was a minister. And then he got called back to his church that he grew up in Tacoma. And at the time, it was a predominantly white church, but it became very ethnically diverse. No, I will say it's racially diverse, not ethnically, and not culturally diverse. So those of us who are brown understand what that means. But for those watching who are white, there are lots of churches that have people of different color, but still operate according to white middle class values and norms. And I
mhm,
will say that was the church that we are a part of. And I didn't realize because I had not been politically active, I didn't realize until I decided to run for office that, oh my gosh, all these people think Republicans the only way. And I literally would be in the middle of a service and someone would walk up to me and call me a baby killer in the middle of a church service. Just random people would come up. But what I learned from that side is there's this weird conflation of faith or religion. I'm not going to call it faith, religion and politics on that side. But then when I decided to run as a Democrat, the other interesting thing is because we're in the Pacific Northwest and not in Chicago or Atlanta,
Atlanta.
because we don't live in a place where there's lots of Black people. What white Democrats don't understand is if we lived in a Black metropolitan area, almost everybody Black would vote Democrat and would run Democrat. But because there's not that large community here, and because I was the first Black woman to run statewide, there was this disconnect between my faith and how could you be a Democrat then? Like you're really a Republican calling yourself a Democrat. And I'm like, no, if we were in Chicago, this would not even be a conversation. But there's an assumption of a certain way that faith is practiced by white Republicans, white evangelicals, that is just not how I operate in public schools and thinking about justice because of my faith. And that's what drives me. For so many of my white evangelical friends, they see either being apolitical as the way they're supposed to be, or like being anti same-sex marriage, being like picking out these 2 or 3 things as being the way they show faith. And for me, my faith is intersected with politics in a different way, not about a political party, but about how I choose to engage in the polis, in the community.
I'm glad you brought that up about the whole political intersection of it, because I too faced that when I ran. And I remember taking a phone call very late at night. I happened to answer it, and it was a group of white voters in the 48th who wanted to ask me a question. And they were dancing around the question. I didn't quite understand what it is that they were asking. And finally, I realized that they were trying to ask me. I remember saying, "Are you asking me, am I pro-choice?" And they said, "Yes, that's the question." And I said, "Yes, I'm pro-choice. I'm not an evangelical." I addressed it with them because their automatic assumption, to your point, the automatic assumption is that if we as Black people run for public office, that we are running as Republicans and that we want to do harm to other people. So I really appreciate that context that you gave. Dr. J, you were did you have something to add to that? Because I noticed, I thought you wanted to jump in when Erin was talking. Did you want to comment on that?
Actually, I want to go back to Stefani,
Okay.
going to be Doc Coverson, who talked about Christian supremacy or dominance. And if we think about how this country was established, slavers used portions of the Bible to keep our ancestors subservient to them. I guess they left out the parts that told us that we're all created in the image and likeness of God. We're fearfully and wonderfully made. And, listening to Erin, listening to Stefani, yes, I was thinking about the fact that, Christ said, everybody who says, Lord, Lord, isn't even going to enter the kingdom of heaven. He will say, depart from me, you workers of iniquity. I never knew you. And then listening, it really sounds like we're talking about the damage that religion and religiosity is doing. And those were the people who Christ had his greatest and most direct conversations with when he called them a brood of vipers, when he called them hypocrites. These were the church leaders of the day, if you will. That's the narrative he had for them, not for those who did not know him, because that wasn't even his purpose why he was necessarily here. And a lot of what we're hearing from people who profess Christ, the question is really, as Erin said, do they even know him? I was in a very interesting situation because when running a piece of legislation, I was shocked that the Democrats and the Republicans were not working together, because when I grew up last century in the Department of Veterans Affairs, and we had to go to Congress to bat for our veterans, we were taught that we talked with everybody on both sides of the aisle, or however many aisles there were, to get the best that we could for our veterans. So when I saw that polarization, I think Erin and I might have been running at the same time, different offices. And I remember sitting in, I guess we were in the Senate. I was there with the team. And I said, if I ran as a Republican, would you all vote for me? They said, no, Dr. Johnson. I said, you're my right-hand person. You wouldn't vote for me? No. I said, well, explain to me, help me understand why that is. So you know who I am and where I stand for. Why wouldn't you vote for me if I ran as an R? I was told because we wouldn't want to risk losing the seat in the district. I couldn't even process that. And so when running as a Democrat, I'm over here in these same churches that Erin's talking about, with these what would be considered right-wing evangelicals. But see, they knew me back in the day when we were ministering together, and they prayed for me. Why? Because we weren't praying for their agenda. We were praying for the will of God. And Christ's message is really simple: love. And not as an emotion, but as an act of our will. So when we show up, you said at the opening, Cindi, you said that you don't carry around the Bible. Christ ain't said nothing about carrying around no Bible. But what he did say is that we need to be living epistles. What that means is having his word and his teachings in our heart, so that when asked, we can answer. And yes, I have been in positions, the most recent one, where people would come to me after I gave a speech or a presentation or said something in a meeting. They would hit me up after and talk about and say point blank, God used you to speak to me. And I very nicely talked to them about God. Why? Because that's how they approached me. And and I'm writing a book, and I almost entitled it, Just Because You Don't Know Him Don't Mean I Don't. And was I proselytizing? No. But when someone says that the Lord impacted their life through something that I did, well, yes, we go stand there. We're going to praise him and encourage them, because so many people are hurting. And there's one text that I was really thinking about. I listened to both Stefani and Erin, and that is when Christ was saying, you gave me water, give me water when I was thirsty. You clothed me when I was naked. You visit me in prison. Rewarded. Those who didn't do it were not rewarded. They're like, well, when did we see you? When did we see you thirsty, Lord? When did we see you naked? When did we see you in prison? He said, as it is written, when you do it to the least of these, you do it unto me. It goes back to what Stephanie was talking about, what Erin was talking about. I think we call those in this state vulnerable populations, underserved or unserved communities, people who have been traditionally, historically, and continually marginalized. When you do it to the least of these, you do it unto us. So, and showing up then with that heart, perfect? Absolutely not. Make a mistake? Please forgive me. But you can't ask for forgiveness when people don't tell you that you've harmed them. So it really is about us being real clear about who we are, why we are, how we're going to relate in this context called society, and what legacy we're going to live. And as Black women in any role, women of faith, that is often what gets us in most trouble. Why? Because we operate uncompromisingly, unapologetically in our Christ essence. And we paid a price to get to this.
And it is the most necessary element in society right now, is to have faith at the center of everything that is going on right now. We will not make it. We will not make it without it. And I don't, I'm seeing comments come through. It's nice to see Gina Hall on here commenting. And I loved her comment that Christians should not be a political party. We are to speak truth to all parties. Absolutely. Amen to that. Right.
You know what? Can I share a really positive experience I had with, I'm going to be really careful to say that there are really amazing Christians who are Republican and really amazing Democrats who are Christian. When I decided to run for office, I'm not a big D. I'm not political. Like as an educator, I see it as my job to educate every child. So whether their parents vote hard R all the time or super left wing, my job is to serve all children. And that's really, I hoped, because it was a nonpartisan race, that I could run nonpartisan, but you can't win that election nonpartisan. You can't win any executive roles nonpartisan. So I knew that I couldn't run as a Republican because of the rhetoric that was coming out of the Republican Party that year. Trump was running at the time, and he had said some really awful things about the Black community already at the time that I was thinking about running. And I decided, I went to meet the chair of the Republican Party for the state of Washington. She's not the chair anymore, but she was the chair in 2016. And I went and met with her, and I wanted her to understand I'm a Jesus girl. And I was really honest with her. I said, I'm a Jesus girl, but I can't run as a Republican because right now your national leadership is so anti-Black and anti-immigrant that for me as an educator of immigrant children and being a Black woman, I can't run as a Republican. But here's why I teach. I teach because I see it as my ministry. And can I tell you, she was so receptive of that here's a crazy, I don't know if I've told you the story before, but she called me about a month later and said, Erin, I know it would not be good for the Republican Party to endorse you, so I'm not going to endorse you. But what I'm going to do is I personally support you. She, at the time that she was the leader, put out a video, and she would name every person she was endorsing or supporting in a video to the entire Republican Party across the state of Washington. And she did a video about me and said, we as a party don't endorse Erin Jones, but I personally endorse Erin Jones because she is in this for the right reason. And I will forever appreciate her for that. And so I want to be really clear that I think, unfortunately, I think at the national level, the Republican Party and white evangelicalism has become just so intertwined in ways that are really unhealthy. So at the national level, just the rhetoric has become really entangled. And there are still really great people that are part of the party. And what I would challenge folks is, if that's you and you really love Jesus and you recognize that conflict, I think what I would call you to is to speak up. Because here's the most painful thing is I am seeing way too many of my white friends who don't agree with things that Trump is saying or other state leaders are saying, but say nothing, say absolutely nothing, and just keep voting Republican. And as your sister in Christ, one of the ways that you can show up for us is to speak up and to say, man, I am conservative, whether you're pro-life or not. We need you to speak up and say, this is just not okay. And I will say, I do the same for the Democratic Party. I tell people I'm not a Biden fanatic at all, not even close to it. I am very critical of the Democratic Party too. And because of my beliefs, I speak up when I see things that the Democratic Party is doing that I believe is against the will of God. So I think we do have to be critical of both, but I would invite, in places where we're seeing people just vote a particular way and not ever question, that feels really painful. It feels like you just don't care. And it feels like you are in support of the ways that minoritized communities are being treated, often, especially at the national level, by the Republican Party.
Mm-hmm.
And I'll say the Democratic Party hasn't been great to Black folks. So I just want to acknowledge that too. We've talked about that before, but
and we're seeing that in the
yes,
undecided numbers that are showing up in these primaries right now. So that is going to be fascinating to see how the D's and the R's are definitely trying to pull the Black community in heavily to vote for them. So that's going to be the next few months to watch how this all starts to shake itself out. Ms. Coverson, I feel like I'm talking past you. Did you have something you wanted to add more into this too?
Oh, you were not talking past me. I was really sitting with what Erin was saying, encouraging folks to speak up. And, that's so important. And also, voting up is important, right? Because the thing is, and I struggle with this, and I'm going to bring it full circle. The reason why I struggle with just speaking up and then casting your vote while uh, you may not be racist. What is the difference between people who write racist legislation and who vote for racist legislation,
Mhm.
or the people that write that legislation, right? And so, really, there is no difference because that legislation or those candidates are being put forward. And so, I would just encourage, like, our friends, that it's not just enough to speak up or say, like, oh my gosh, Trump is batshit crazy, but I won't vote for Joe Biden. And I'm actually quoting somebody that was interviewed on a special that is supposed to be airing. Um, and I will also say, like Erin, I am very critical of the Democratic Party. And in particular, these turn of events, uh, what is going on and being inflicted against my siblings in Palestine. And I'm voting undecided. And I have never done that before, but I cannot. Like, I couldn't send out Christmas cards this year. Like, as, um, Bethlehem being bombed and, Merry Christmas. And so, and I know that is, in some ways a very different, topic from this conversation. Um, But I think it's important with these life altering, life ending uh, pieces of legislations, planks and platforms, entire platforms that we are learning about from these particular parties. We've got to do more than speaking up. And I'm hoping that given the fact that there is this electoral college, racism, that's why all of our votes are not collectively counted and tallied. But with these electoral college votes, even though the Democratic Party is only seeing 100,000 votes here undecided, 50,000 votes there undecided, depending on the states and depending on, who turns out to vote in the election, you know, that could be wins or losses of electoral college votes. So I think it is time for us to take bold,
Mhm.
um, bold steps to demand change,
Mhm.
both domestic and globally.
That's so important. I'm looking at my Equal Justice Initiative calendar for 2024, which portrays a Black woman with her mouth wide open, leading what appears to be a protest. And, you know, tomorrow, March 6th, or today, or excuse me, tomorrow, March 7th, is referred to as Bloody Sunday. And they have written here, police use tear gas, whips, and clubs to attack supporters of Black voting rights marching from Selma to Montgomery, Alabama. Dozens are hospitalized in what is later called Bloody Sunday. And, if we really are true followers, and then now I'm speaking of Christ now in particular, um, it really does behoove us not to just speak up, but to show up and be prepared to die for what we're standing for. I don't know if anybody saw the movie Origin, Ava DuVernay's take on Isabel Wilkerson's journey when she wrote the book Cast. But in there, when I heard his voice, I started crying in the movies because you see, I went to Selma. I went to Selma when they previewed the movie Just Mercy, because that took place in Montgomery, and they wanted to show it December 20th, I think it was, in Montgomery before it opened nationwide January 2021, if I'm remembering correctly. And on that journey, I went. It was an assignment from God, because you see, Dr. King thought that whole Bloody Sunday incident was a failure. And so I walked as far as I could from Selma to Montgomery, believing, hope, I think we talked about that earlier, that we would be the generation to finally get voting rights for all passed. Anyone who has read any of the teachings of Christ, of which Dr. King was one, and he went to India and met with Gandhi and saw their whole system and decided that the nonviolent action would be the best way to operationalize Christ's teachings, because he believed that that was the only way, if we live that lifestyle, we could be a just society. And I would just ask all of us to consider, well, who are we really, and what are we really called to do? What are we willing to die for? You know, Dad said to me when I was in my 20s, if I wasn't prepared to die for something that I wasn't equipped to live, well, I was too egocentric and arrogant and knew way too much back then to even be concerned about anyone other than myself, and certainly wasn't trying to die for anything or anyone. Well, a few decades later, I understand, and I thank Dad for asking me that or making that statement to me, because that took me on a curiosity journey of, well, who am I and what is worth dying for? I now have an answer for that. But really, you asked Cindi, I think it was a couple of weeks ago, of our guests, what are you prepared to sacrifice? What are you willing to give up? Well, that really is a question to the audience today too. What are you prepared to sacrifice? What are you prepared to give up? To make sure that the babies are fed, that everybody has a house, can afford health care, have a right to vote, to be able to go to the store, drive, jog, or sleep in our own homes without worrying about being shot because of what we look like.
It's an important question to put back out there, to repeat it. We did ask that a couple weeks ago. About what are you willing, you just use the word, are you willing to die for this? What are you willing to sacrifice to change this trajectory? Like, Black women are sacrificing everything to make sure all of our lives are better. What is the white community willing to do and willing to sacrifice to make sure our lives are? It's just really important. If you look at, many of the service organizations that are serving people, those are heavily staffed with Black people, serving and making sure that, people are fed and people are housed, and, the work of the Father, right? Making sure yes, it's such an important question to answer now.
Well, and I just want to speak to that too. Something you just said really struck me, and it's something I've been thinking about a lot. I hear a lot of white Christian male leaders who feel like they are being threatened. Their lifestyle and their way of being is being threatened. And instead of having mercy and grace, there's a ton of fear and anger and attacks on other. And that other often is Black, and it's trans, and it's queer. And I find it interesting that, having lived in another country, and I have friends who have experienced real persecution. I have a lot of friends that lived in the Middle East at times when being a Christian could literally cost you your life. I think it's so interesting the numbers of white men I hear who feel like their religion is being threatened in this country, which it's just so ironic. And it's almost like if it's not the center, they feel like it's being threatened. And there is no way that Christianity is still not the center. I mean, as a nation, I look at my friends who are Muslim. I have a friend who can't wear hijab because people tear it off her head. I mean, my Muslim friends are being persecuted in this country. My trans students are being persecuted in this country. So it's so interesting, the numbers of white Christian friends that I have who feel like because you're not allowed to pray in schools, that's persecution. Sorry, that's not persecution. It's just you not being at the center. And
Mhm.
and so I just find it really interesting. Just I'm going to go back to something I said at the very beginning, where I see way too many white folks who are using their religion as a bludgeon.
Mhm.
And where for me and for those of us on this call and several of the people watching who I happen to know, for us, it's what gives us faith to keep persevering. And it's not about bludgeoning other, it's about calling people in. Like for me, my faith is about calling other people in. And when I make it good for the least of these, we make it great for everyone. But what I see too often, and I think it comes from the prosperity gospel, is there's this scarcity mentality. If I give to you, I'm taking from me. Do you know, 2 weeks ago in Washington State, there was a bill on the floor of the House, or in the House Ed Committee, that was going to ensure food for every child in the state of Washington during school days. And 200 people showed up against the bill to testify against the bill. And here's what I can promise you, because I had a friend there. It was 200 Christian people who have somehow believed this lie that giving things to poor people, government giving things to poor people, is demonic. And that socialism in itself is demonic. And I just, when I look at how Jesus lived, and he asked the disciples, we're going to give up everything. We're going to put all our stuff together and we're going to live together. Right.
Jesus.
That to me is socialism. I've lived in a socialist country. I lived in a social democracy. We still elected our officials, but part of our ethos was, we're going to make sure everybody gets cared for. So if you lose your job, we're going to make sure you get retraining to get another job. We did not have a homeless person in my city, in my entire 12 years of living in the Netherlands. There was one man who was homeless. He was a professor who was doing a research project to see how people would treat homeless folks. One man. The Dutch government makes sure that everyone is fed and clothed and educated through their PhD if they want it. And that's evil? And yet we got 200 people signing up here against a bill to feed children. Like are we reading the same Bible?
So I think it predates prosperity gospel. And I think demonic is code, because what we do know is the reason why, tuition is hijacked starting in California when Ronald Reagan was governor, was the protests against the Vietnam War and protests in favor of civil rights, and frankly, the Black Panthers, and this whole fear that Black people were going to get something. This is the reason why, first of all, like the Black Panthers were the first iteration of the WIC program, right? So when we talk about persisting and building within our own communities, the Black Panthers created that. But what you hear about the Black Panthers is that they were radical, socialist, domestic terrorists that were actually really making sure, A, children had breakfast in the morning. B, they were escorting them, back and forth to school, stepping in for parents who, could not take their kids back and forth to school. So there was a lot of social infrastructure, what was going on. But instead, the legacy, the common, teaching legacy of the Black Panthers, something completely different. But it's just because all of that is the reason why you cannot work and put yourself through school, or the reason why, there was the encouragement of student loans versus Pell Grants. This is also the reason why we don't have universal health care, right? Because this idea that we don't want Black people to have things that we ourselves would rather go into financial ruin and bankruptcy when, there is a medical issue or health concern in our home. It is the reason why we don't have like a basic income, basic health care, uh, these programs that you're talking about right now, it is this idea of if we agree to have these things, we're giving to lazy people that
Mhm.
we don't, that don't deserve it. Um, and that whole narrative, racist, right? Because who built this country for free?
Mhm.
So, I'm confused as to how we went from building everything to laziness, but okay. Um, but putting that all aside, those programs benefit white communities more than Black communities just because of the sheer number.
Mhm.
So why would you want to experience these things? Um, so, there is, I think, that aspect of it that is really so troubling. And it all kind of ties back into this, what Dr. J was saying earlier, that was also on the tip of my tongue about, the least of these,
Mhm.
right? And so, why do you want children hungry? Or those horrific meals, like if you haven't satisfied your lunch bill, like, why are you subjecting children to that? And that's not the Jesus that I grew up being exposed to and knowing. That's not WWJD.
Right.
So, it really comes back to like this white Christian nationalism, um, and frankly, this desire, I think, when we talk about make America great again, like we are really talking like, pre 1865,
Right.
definitely prior to 1964. And so, like, let's say what it is. Like,
Mm.
just be clear about it and stop with the demonic and, kind of the other coded language. Like, say it with your whole chest.
Mhm.
You sound like the author of Dying of Whiteness. And
Because I am dying of, oh, sorry, go ahead.
indeed, when she's talking about the sum of us, this is. I'm gonna be quick, Cindy, because I know you probably want to end. But I was reminded back to Dad again. Dad called me one day and said, "Karen, uh, Jesus would be an ultra liberal if he were here," and hung up the phone. And I'm like, "Dad, I just love you." That he did this. Well, what was he talking about? He was talking about exactly what we're all talking about: the health care, the basic income, the housing, the feeding the children. This was his philosophy. And after Judas betrayed Christ on the cross and died in Potter's Field, they had to pick another apostle, disciple. So, and they did this, and the Bible records that the people brought everything they had, except for Ananias and Sapphira. You have to just Google that on your own because I don't have time to tell the story. Well, maybe I do. They lied. They gave what they gave what they wanted to give, but they said it was their all, and they lied. What did they have to lie about? Just do what you can. And the reason why they did that was so that the apostles could distribute to make sure that everyone's needs were met. Now, I'm not quite sure, maybe perhaps people missed this in the book of Acts, but if our public policies reflected, we were talking about the whites, I guess, read the same Bible and acted in ways, public policy arena, the way it showed up in the Bible, maybe things would be different. And it goes back, I'm reminded of, and maybe this is why nobody wanted us to learn how to read. What I find fascinating is Black people, Africans at the time who were enslaved, were taught portions of the Bible to memorize. And isn't it interesting that we're the ones who actually are living it out?
Mhm.
And maybe perhaps that's why Black women will be leading in the forefront of
Mhm.
rebuilding our society,
Mhm.
because it's the heart of Christ, not the
Mhm.
letter of the law. He came to fulfill the law. And the basic law right now is love. And that's when if you look at the pro equity, anti racism, ecosystem plan and playbook values, you find words like love and what that means: justice, access, belonging, dignity, humanity. And if state agencies, if we acted and showed up in ways with those as values, our true north values that guided our decisions and our actions, perhaps we really can achieve equity and justice for all, be a more equitable state and nation.
Amen.
And I just want to say, like, really quickly, like, what do you think would happen, like the miracle of the feeding of the 5,000, where Jesus was like, no, I'm sorry, we only have 5 loaves and 2 fish, and that's
And
for
we go
me.
throw away the leftovers.
Right. And only like 10 of the 12 apostles, you know, that. So just this greed, greed and hoarding of
Mm.
resources when there is enough
More
to
than
go around. There's more than enough to go
enough.
around.
Mhm. Ubuntu, is that the word? Ubuntu?
Ubuntu.
Ubuntu, yeah. We all go together. Look, this is God, we could talk, this group, we could talk for hours about these topics. Like, this is such an important one to be talking about with our faith and what we want to see in the world, which is, frankly, when I hear it referred to that the work that Black women are enduring, I think, Stephanie, you were commenting about how it's viewed as we're just trying to hand out free stuff to poor Black lazy people. Uh, you know, when in fact we see who the real socialists are in this world. Uh, and the fact that Black people and Black women are just trying to have the same things that you have, that other people have. It's not asking for something any different or more. It's disgusting to hear 200 people showed up at the Capitol and testified against lunch for kids. I just, Jesus, take the wheel, because I just can't even believe what what is inside of a human being to be able to stand up in front and testify against feeding a child. I can't get my head around that, and I don't even want to be around people like that. That is pure ugliness from my perspective. It's hurtful to hear. It's just so terrible. Closing words before quickest hour of the day. Closing words before I do want to let our audience know about next week's show, because we're going to have an opportunity. I'm going to let you have closing words, and then please stay on with me while I tell you what's coming up next week. Final thoughts, team?
I think the thing that I was on the Phil show a few weeks ago, and the thing that God really convicted me of afterwards is God has called us to love not just our brothers and sisters, not just people like us, not just people who we like or who are kind to us. He's also called us to like those people who sign up against that food bill. And so that's my challenge, right? Is like, how do we live this out? Like, this is really hard. And without faith, I'd be pissed all the time. But it's part of my faith practice. Like, God has called me to love my enemy too. And so the practice is, what do we do when no one's watching? What are the practices that we have? I wake up every morning and do meditation for 15 minutes. I mean, I'm just pretty disciplined about that. And I want to encourage folks out there, like, what are those practices that are sustaining you and making you able to persevere? Because we are heading into a season that I think is going to be the worst that I've seen in my lifetime. I thought the last election was bad. I think this one's going to be worse. And the outcome may be worse than anything we've seen. And so I want to encourage people, first of all, kindness is free, and God has called us to be kind and to love our neighbors, but he's also called us to love our enemies. And so that is my challenge to me. It's really hard to love my enemy right now, and it's what I know God's called me to. It's easy to love my friend. It's easy to love my neighbor who's like me, but God has called me to love everyone.
Thank you, Erin. As I was feeling like Medea a moment ago. Dr. J, were you going to say something? Closing words?
I'm just going to summarize pretty much what Erin has been saying for those who are wondering, where is she getting all this stuff? Matthew chapter 5. That's where you'll find the Sermon on the Mount, pretty much what Jesus taught, often referred to as the Beatitudes. And I'm going to, and she talked about persevering, so I'm just going to leave it in the words of Mary. I I just can't give up now. You know, I've come too far from where I started from. Nobody told me that the road was going to be easy. I don't believe he brought me this far to leave me. And if you're AME, African Methodist Episcopal, you might have heard we've come this far by faith, leaning on the Lord, right? So you're trusting in his holy word. He never failed me yet. And so just keep the faith, now faith. Do you, he'll show you who you are, just like there's an owner manual in your glove compartment that talks about how to take care of the car. I would encourage you to spend some time with the creator so you'll understand how you were designed, who you are, and how you're to show up. Because let's not be confused here, as I think we've said tonight, sitting in a garage no more makes you a car than sitting in a pew makes you a follower of Christ.
Thank you, Dr. J. Quickly, Stephanie, do you have something final to say?
I just invite folks to center the impacted, right? Center those who are the furthest away from social justice, economic justice, racial justice, and just the least of these. And so and self-care, whatever that looks like for you, because we are currently in and heading into more turbulent times.
Yes. Thank you. Thank you all for, ladies, for being here tonight. Thank you to our audience who joined this evening. I want you, next week, we're going to be talking about Black women and healthcare, taking care of ourselves. We have Senator Patty Cooter coming on. Legislative session is over tomorrow. And so we're going to be able to start having some of our elected officials and getting to hear some of the bills that are passed. Senator Cooter has announced her run for the Washington State Insurance Commissioner. It's our time to influence a potentially new person in that seat for what we need to have here in Washington State to change the trajectory for Black people and Black women. So thank you all for joining tonight. Have a good week. We'll see you next Wednesday.
Half that up in sacks, I favor Black businesses. Assuming I'm rooting for everybody that's Black. Yeah.